The air inside the forgotten storage room felt still, like a breath held too long by a building that remembered more than it ever confessed. Dust hovered in slow suspension, drifting through a thin crack of afternoon light that cut across the narrow space. For a moment, stepping inside felt like interrupting a scene that had been paused for decades, a frame from a documentary where the narrator had vanished mid-sentence. The silence was so layered it almost had texture, as if each particle of dust carried a trace of the story that began here in 1989, when a young woman named Marena Lorne, aged 27, vanished from a quiet coastal neighborhood in northern Florida. A story that never found its ending. Her name had survived the years like an unresolved note, remembered by the few who still whispered about the case. Marena had been a local portrait photographer with a modest studio on the edge of Clearwater. She lived alone, preferred evenings by the water, and worked on a long-form photography series about imperfection, shadows, cracks, reflections. People said she liked to capture things that didn't fit neatly in frames. Her disappearance had confused investigators then. Her life appeared ordinary, steady, nearly transparent. No formal disputes, no apparent tensions, no contradictions in her schedule. And yet she vanished, leaving behind a camera bag, a locked apartment, and a trail of unanswered questions. I stood in the room where the earliest boxes of evidence were stored, the temperature slightly cooler than the hallway outside, the air carrying the faint smell of cardboard softened by age. When I moved, the floor creaked softly, a sound that echoed with unnecessary volume. This was where the first wave of documents, photographs, and statements from the investigation had been placed after the case went cold in the early 90s. It had been untouched for years. Even the labels on the boxes looked faded, handwritten in blue marker that had bled into the tape. I reached for the nearest evidence folder, touching it carefully, as if disturbing it might disturb something else buried within the silence. The corners were stiff with dust. I brushed them off with the side of my hand, leaving a faint streak. The sense of stepping backward in time was almost physical. The world outside this room belonged to phones and digital proofs. Inside here, everything felt analog, slower, more deliberate. It was a room preserved by neglect. Opening the folder felt like reopening the wound of the case. Inside were black and white photos of Marena's apartment the night officers entered. A small living space with minimal decoration, a bookshelf half filled, a coffee mug left beside a window with a thin ring at the bottom. Nothing broken, nothing chaotic, no sign of intrusion. The clinical plastic sleeves contained more than images. They held the stillness of that night, a stillness that suggested something had been interrupted abruptly. The coroner's notes followed next, though the file had never been updated with a confirmed cause of passing because her remains weren't recovered until 2 years later. Even then, the conclusion was ambiguous, the language restrained, the analysis cautious. It listed nonspecific trauma and indeterminate circumstances. It was the kind of phrasing that concealed more than it revealed. Every detail felt like a whisper of something missing. In those early months, investigators focused on routine angles, acquaintances, coworkers, neighbors, but no evidence pointed cleanly in any direction. With each passing month, the case loosened its grip on the city's memory until it dissolved into rumor, kept alive only by those who felt something about it had never been properly examined. And now, decades later, I was back at the threshold of the same mystery, feeling the weight of that silence settling again. What happened to Marena Lorne? Why did her case never align itself with clarity? Why did this room feel like a place where answers resisted being found? A narrow drawer caught my attention, just slightly ajar. I slid it open with careful pressure. Inside was a small envelope, sealed, unclassified, unlogged. The handwriting read only, "Studio Closet." The date was smudged. Something about the envelope felt fragile, as if it contained a memory that had waited far too long. I held it between my fingers for a moment, listening to the subtle crispness of old paper. It felt like the beginning of a path that had once been overlooked. And that, after decades of quiet, became the place where the story began again. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. It started with a phone call, brief, hesitant, delivered by a clerk from the archival office. "There's something here you might want to see," she had said, her voice calm but thoughtful. "Something from the Lorne case, something that wasn't in the inventory before." No explanation, no speculation, just that. A single missing piece returning on its own terms. The envelope now lay open before me on a metal table in the evidence review room. Inside was a single photograph, faded but still clear enough to decipher. It showed the interior of Marena's small photography studio, taken from the perspective of the back door. The subject was not Marena herself, but a partially opened closet in the far corner. The angle was unusual, as if the picture had been taken in a hurry, without adjusting focus or posture. I studied it closely. On the right edge of the frame was something I hadn't seen in any of the original documentation, a small, rectangular object barely visible behind a stack of fabric rolls. Not large, not obvious, but solid enough to leave a faint silhouette. A lockbox of some kind, one that was never listed in the initial search report. I leaned back, letting the stillness settle. The discovery alone didn't justify reopening a case, but it suggested an oversight. And oversight, especially in a case this old, meant possibility. I placed the photo under a lamp, tilting it slightly. The grain of the paper reflected the light unevenly, giving the impression of movement that wasn't there. It felt like a memory trying to speak. The official reopening of the case happened quietly, without ceremony. I signed the necessary forms, retrieved the full archive, and secured a new workspace. There was no announcement to the public, no ripple through the media, just a simple acknowledgement that new material warranted new eyes. I kept returning to the photograph, the angle, the framing, the sense of urgency embedded within the shot. Someone took this picture intentionally, not as artistic output, not as studio documentation, but as a record of something that mattered. A silent message that had never been decoded. Why was it missing from the original file? Why did it appear now? Who had placed the envelope in storage without identification? Every question pulled another thread, and I followed them with slow, measured steps. I reviewed the studio inventory list from July 1989. The closet was mentioned briefly as containing fabric, tripods, and unused props. No mention of a lockbox. If one had been present, someone either overlooked it or omitted it with intention. The photo itself contained another small detail, a faint reflection on the closet door, as if someone else stood behind the photographer at the moment the picture was taken. The reflection was barely discernible, a blur, a distortion, but undeniably human-shaped. The image didn't give a face, it didn't give a gesture, it gave nothing clear, but it gave presence, and presence was enough. I filed the photo into a new evidence sleeve labeled Recovered Image, uncatalogued. The act of writing it felt heavier than the pen in my hand. I placed it alongside the earlier crime scene documentation and stepped back. The reopening of a case isn't dramatic, it's procedural. But sometimes, beneath the monotony of paperwork and signatures, something subtler stirs. A sense that the past is shifting, adjusting, preparing to be unearthed. That feeling settled into the room now, quiet but unmistakable. As I sat down, the smell of old paper mingled with the metallic scent of the filing cabinet. The sound of a single page turning felt amplified. I let the silence stretch, the weight of the moment settling evenly. One photograph, one lockbox, one unexplained reflection. It was enough to bring the echoes of 1989 back into focus. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. The old reports were stacked in 3 uneven piles. Paper yellowed on the edges, some pages thin enough to reveal the faint outline of text on the reverse side. I approached them the way one approaches artifacts, carefully, deliberately, aware of how easily they tear when handled with too much certainty. The first stack contained incident logs from the night Marena was reported missing. The language was procedural, stripped of emotion, offering only structural glimpses into the timeline. Neighbor reports, entry notes, brief observations. I read them slowly, letting each detail breathe. A neighbor mentioned hearing a car door around midnight, but assumed it belonged to someone on the adjacent property. Another note described a faint scent of cleaning chemical in the studio kitchen, but officers dismissed it at the time. A third report referenced a misplaced light switch panel that seemed loose, yet was not considered relevant. None of these details were highlighted. I continued reading, marking the edges of pages lightly with pencil. The more I moved through the reports, the more I sensed a subtle drift, a pattern of small anomalies that individually meant nothing but collectively formed a quiet irregularity. Not mistakes, but omissions. The path led next to statements. They were typed transcripts from interviews conducted in the weeks after her disappearance. The tone differed with each voice, some sharp, some wandering, some too precise, as if rehearsed. I sifted through them as if holding competing stories up to the light. One line from a coworker stood out. She once said she didn't like people touching things in her studio. It was an offhand remark, nearly lost in the middle of a paragraph. It suggested boundaries, habits, a sense of control over her workspace. If that was true, the presence of a lockbox, unlogged, unnoticed, felt contradictory. Another line came from a neighbor. She had visitors sometimes, quiet ones. No follow-up questions were recorded. I paused, placing the page aside. The silence around that detail felt intentional. Eventually, I reached the final folder in the stack, an evidence summary written 6 months after the case went cold. The narrative felt resigned, as if constructed to close a door rather than open one. I scanned each line, searching for discrepancies. It wasn't a dramatic revelation that caught my attention. It was a timestamp. One photo, taken the night officers entered Marena's apartment, had a developed timestamp that differed from the logged time by 9 minutes. Not long, not unusual for analog processes, but the discrepancy aligned nearly exactly with when a separate officer logged stepping outside to speak with a bystander. The unexplained photograph from the closet, recently recovered, was also time-stamped, though degraded. The faded number aligned suspiciously close to that same 9-minute window. Coincidences can happen, but logic suggested something else. The missing photograph may have been taken when attention was elsewhere. I closed the last folder carefully, letting the quiet envelop the room again. The details were emerging, not in sudden bursts, but in slow accumulations, small shadows shifting into shape. Somewhere within the reports the truth was present, just faint, just waiting. The re-examination of past interviews began with the names most frequently mentioned in the old notes. They surfaced like fragments of a submerged structure, visible only when looked at from the right angle. I created a new chart on the wall, methodical and spare, each name written small and clean to avoid preconceptions. 3 names formed the initial triangle. 1. Evan Mercer, Marena's former landlord. 2. Lysa Detrone, a fellow photographer who had once shared a studio wall. 3. Jonah Reed, a quiet handyman who occasionally repaired equipment for local artists. Their connections to Marena differed, some tenuous, some practical, but all had been present in the original investigation. None were pursued beyond preliminary questioning. I began with Mercer. Evan Mercer. His old interview transcript carried a tone that felt too measured. He claimed he barely knew Marena beyond routine rent collection. The notes described him as neutral, cooperative. But neutrality itself can conceal tension. Mercer managed several properties in the area then, and his financial situation during the late 80s was unstable. A small detail in his file, an unpaid equipment loan from 1988, stood out. If he had needed funds urgently, anything of value inside the studio might have tempted him. Yet nothing in the original evidence suggested forced entry, and nothing was taken. I replayed the interview recording, grainy, distant, with a faint hum from the air conditioner in the background. Mercer's responses were deliberate, but one moment caused me to pause. When asked if he ever entered the studio without notice, he hesitated before replying, only when necessary. The silence before that answer was brief but weighted. I marked the timestamp. Still, motive requires friction, and in Marena's case, no financial conflict was documented between them. His connection remained thin, a line on a map that might lead nowhere. Lisa Detrone. Next was Detrone. Her relationship with Marena had been professionally cordial but creatively competitive. The old reports hinted at silent tension between their respective client bases. During her interview, she described Marena as private and hard to read, though she offered nothing that suggested hostility. But something in her statement struck me as overly polished. She spoke in clear, complete sentences, rarely pausing, never uncertain. People revisiting painful memories usually search for words. She delivered hers like prepared text. I reread her interview transcript again and noticed she avoided referencing specific dates or interactions, instead keeping everything broad. One line she said lingered. I never understood her need to keep everything locked up. Everything locked up. She said it casually, but the phrasing paralleled the presence of the lockbox. Still, competition alone does not equate to motive. Her alibi, working a late-night session at a gallery prep room, was loosely confirmed, though inconsistencies hovered around the exact hours. Jonah Reed. Reed's file felt different, the handyman with an unassuming presence. Quiet, economical with words. Nothing about his history suggested conflict. He had repaired light fixtures in Marena's studio several times. One of the old notes described him as respectful, withdrawn, avoids eye contact. I found his statement short, fragmented, marked by long pauses. I fixed the ceiling track. She wasn't in, left the invoice, never went back. No contradiction, no tension, no apparent motive. Yet something in the phrasing of his last line, never went back, felt final in a way that suggested more than routine distance. I highlighted it. I moved from the transcripts to the photographic evidence, examining each crime scene image with a magnifier. I wasn't searching for revelations. I was searching for absences. What wasn't shown, what wasn't listed, what wasn't noticed. A note caught my attention in the corner of an evidence card. Closet inventory incomplete, follow-up pending. There was no follow-up recorded. 3 suspects, 3 different motives, each faint, each possible, none compelling enough on their own. The narrative remained diffuse, like light passing through uneven glass. I added another name to the chart, Marena herself, not as a suspect but as the central axis. Her routines, boundaries, habits. Understanding her was essential. A crime doesn't occur in isolation. It occurs in the fault lines of a person's life. Slowly, the board filled with arrows, dates, and small observations. The silence in the room felt denser than before, as if the past was shifting, revealing new angles through deliberate study rather than revelation. The suspects weren't colliding with each other. They were orbiting something that hadn't yet been uncovered. Something in her studio, something in that closet, something once kept locked. And the logic pointed toward one of them, seeing what they were never meant to see. Clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The pattern surfaced in fragments, subtle inconsistencies embedded in the earliest documents. I revisited the studio photographs, letting each one settle into place. The floor tiles, the arrangement of props, the position of the lighting diffusers. Most of it matched the inventory list. One detail did not. A single light stand, slightly bent near the hinge. Barely noticeable, but in the taped crime scene image taken from the right angle, it cast a warped shadow across the floor. The bend suggested pressure applied unevenly. Something or someone had used it to brace or push against. No report mentioned it. Small but meaningful. Objects become silent witnesses. They don't lie, they just wait. I noted the angle of the bend, comparing it to the height of the closet door handle captured in the recovered photograph. The alignment was approximate, but not impossible. If someone tried to pry the closet open, before or after Marena vanished, it would explain the bend. I returned to the old statements. Mercer mentioned never entering without reason, yet there was an unlogged maintenance request from Marena found in an old envelope. Track light flickering, please inspect. It was addressed to the management office, not to Reed. The timing placed it roughly a week before she vanished. But the work wasn't recorded as completed. If Mercer visited that day, it wasn't documented. Detrone's remarks about Marena locking up everything echoed with new relevance. If she believed Marena was hiding something, photographs, personal work, an idea, creative rivalry might carry emotional undercurrents stronger than the surface suggested. Reed's statement, though brief, contained an overlooked detail. She wasn't in. He said that during a repair, but the maintenance log contradicted him. He was scheduled for a day Marena was supposed to be present, preparing a print order. Why would he specify absence unless the memory aligned with something different than what was written? None of this formed a complete picture yet, but the emotional threads beneath these inconsistencies were starting to surface. The lockbox. The object in the closet, the one faintly visible behind fabric, returned repeatedly to my thoughts. If Marena kept something locked away, the key to understanding the motive lay inside that unseen container. The studio was small. The closet was narrow. Someone familiar with the space might know she kept personal items there. Someone might have looked for something specific. A missing item, a piece of work, a photograph. I reviewed her creative projects. She specialized in portraits, but her side work, unpublished, focused on reflections, capturing what she described in an old interview as the parts of people they don't realize they're showing. Unfiltered moments. Unmasked details. Sometimes artists witness things unintentionally. I flipped through her unfinished contact sheets, stored in a separate envelope. Most showed landscapes, street corners, fragmentary faces. Then I paused at a strip containing 3 nearly identical images. They were blurred around the edges, as if taken from a distance or with a shaking hand. The central figure was unclear. But the silhouette, tall, lean, wearing a jacket with a folded collar, resembled someone in the suspect list. Someone who didn't like being photographed. The emotional conflict was no longer abstract. It was emerging through a visual trail. Reed reconsidered. I returned to Reed's statement. His posture in the photograph I'd seen of him, slight stoop, narrow shoulders, didn't match the silhouette in Marena's photos. But Mercer's frame did. Yet Mercer rarely visited the studio at odd hours, according to tenant schedules. And in 1989, he was struggling financially, not socially. Detrone, however, wore jackets like that in several archived photos from gallery events. The silhouette wasn't a perfect match, but it was closer than Reed. I added the strip of contact prints to the board. The emotional threads. What began as simple inconsistencies now pointed toward emotional stakes. Someone felt watched. Someone felt triggered by something Marena captured. Someone entered that studio when they shouldn't have. Someone saw something inside that closet. The clues weren't loud. They were faint echoes, but emotional traces, when aligned carefully, form patterns more consistent than physical evidence. The deeper I went, the more the case shifted from procedural to personal. Every suspect carried something interior, an unseen conflict, a quiet tension. But only one had the combination of opportunity, emotional trigger, and proximity to the space. And logic, not chance, began to tighten its grip around one name. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. Reed had always been the quiet one in the reports, almost invisible. Notes described him as mild, passive, introverted. No disputes, no tension, no history of friction with Marena. He was considered peripheral to the case, a background figure. But logic often hides in the background. I revisited the maintenance request logs. Something small, almost negligible, stood out. 2 separate handwriting styles appeared on the same page for the same week. One belonged to the property office clerk. The other, less clear, was written next to a note marked completed. The handwriting resembled Reed's signature from his invoice sheets. The problem, the repair listed as completed, wasn't one he was scheduled to handle. I cross-referenced dates. The day the task was marked done was the same day the timestamp discrepancy occurred in the crime scene photographs. The same 9-minute window. I leaned back, letting the realization settle. Reed was in the studio that night. Not officially, not documented, not expected. His statement never went back, now read differently, not as distance but as concealment. I examined the contact prints again. The silhouette didn't match Reed perfectly, but the height did. The jacket collar, common. The posture, slightly angled, matching a stance he had in a candid photo from a community repair event. One more detail surfaced. In the recovered image of the closet, the faint reflection on the door, distorted, showed a shape closer to Reed's narrow stance than to the broader frames of Mercer or Detrone. Reed had reason to be near the closet. He repaired fixtures near it months before. He knew its structure intimately. He may have seen Marena store something inside. If she photographed him accidentally or captured a moment he feared would spread, it could have triggered confrontation. Not purposeful harm, but panic, escalation, silence. Something small, something logical, something human. Reed being overlooked wasn't coincidence. It was construction. He blended into the background so seamlessly that no one questioned his presence. But the evidence, piece by piece, turned toward him. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly, inevitably. and the truth, restrained and unsettling, emerged. The least suspected figure had been the closest all along. The logic of the case settled slowly, like silt drifting downward through a column of water. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, just a gradual clarification as each overlooked detail aligned with the next. By the time the final report draft was ready, the room felt different, lighter in some corners, heavier in others. The truth had emerged, but it carried no triumph, no sense of closure. Only a quiet acknowledgement that something once obscured had become visible. I returned to the same storage room where the process had begun. The air still felt cool, the dust still hung suspended in that narrow blade of light, but the space no longer felt frozen. Something had shifted, even if the shift existed only internally. The boxes sat precisely as before, silent, patient, unchanged, but the weight of their contents had altered. Truth does that. It transforms the stillness without disturbing the dust. On the metal table lay the reconstructed timeline. Reed's unscheduled presence. The handwritten, completed note. The silhouette in the contact prints. The bent light stand. The closet reflection. The lockbox he likely saw. The emotion he likely felt. The mistake that followed. Placed together, the sequence formed something starkly logical, not born of intent but of consequence. Reed wasn't a figure shaped by bitterness or malice. His actions, as pieced together, arose from a convergence of fear, discomfort, and an unexpected discovery. A moment that spiraled. A confrontation that escalated not through anger but through tension neither party anticipated. Something small that led to something irreversible. Just as the twist required, nothing about it relied on coincidence. Each piece had been there in the margins for decades, waiting to be recognized not as fragments but as parts of a cohesive truth. I lifted the recovered photograph again, the one that had reopened everything. The faded ink, the hurried angle, the subtle reflection. It remained the quiet catalyst of the entire reinvestigation. The image itself carried no chaos. It carried intention. Someone wanted it preserved. Someone wanted it found, eventually. Whether that someone had been Reed himself in a moment of conflicted conscience or another hand entirely remained uncertain. But the fact that it surfaced after so many years felt less like chance and more like inevitability. Not miraculous, just overdue. The lockbox, when finally located during a secondary search of archive studio property, contained nothing dramatic. No confession, no incriminating image. Just a collection of Marena's personal photographs, drafts, fragments, exposures she hadn't yet decided to pursue. But in one of them, a figure stood near the studio entrance, barely lit, partially turned away. The angle suggested the shot was accidental, taken during a test exposure. But the body language, even in shadow, carried something uneasy. Reed. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking past it, toward something else in the room. In that frozen posture, I saw the earliest trace of an emotional shift, a discomfort, a tension, a silent plea not to be seen, to be reflected without permission, to be held in an image he hadn't intended to exist. Reed had always felt peripheral. People rarely spoke to him directly. He drifted through spaces like a shadow crossing a wall. Marena's accidental photograph, even unintentional, may have felt invasive, not hostile, just revealing, like she had captured a truth he wasn't ready to face. That emotional thread wound itself through every decision that followed. While drafting the final report, I found myself pausing often, listening to the faint rustle of paper in the room. The weight of each detail pressed down with quiet insistence. Closure in cases like this is procedural, not emotional. You follow the evidence, reconstruct the logic, present the findings. Justice becomes mechanical, a system of steps, signatures, and finalities. But behind those steps lies something softer, not closure but recognition. Marena's life, though cut short, left a trail of moments that still carried meaning. Her photographs, her habits, her studio, all became a testimony to how people leave traces even in silence. She lived by documenting reflections, and in the end, one of those reflections revealed the truth of her passing. Reed's final interview, his new voluntary statement, was the only time he spoke without hesitation. Not a confession in the direct sense, more a release of breath he had held for decades. His words came slowly, shaped by long-buried weight. "I didn't mean," he began, then silence, a long one. He rubbed his palms together. "I just wanted to not be seen." He didn't elaborate, he didn't deny, he didn't justify. He just sat in the stillness, letting the unspoken fill the space between us. Some truths don't need explicit sentences, their presence is enough. He described hearing something fall in the studio that night, described seeing the closet slightly open, described confronting Marena not with anger but with panic, described a moment of movement, hers or his, he didn't say, and then everything becoming too fast, too quiet. A fall, a stillness, a decision not to call anyone. "I didn't know what to do," he whispered. The truth, once laid bare, didn't exonerate him, but it explained him. People often imagine harm emerging from loud motives, rage, greed, jealousy. But sometimes the most ordinary emotions, fear, discomfort, shame, cast the longest shadows. Reed's actions were irreversible, but they weren't born from darkness. They were born from being overwhelmed. The case concluded with an official determination. Responsible party identified, cause reconstructed, timeline verified. The cold case file was finally reclassified. Not as solved. No case involving irreversible loss is ever fully solved, but as closed by evidence and logic. Yet closure for the system differed from closure for the memory. I returned the final folder to the storage shelf and stood in the doorway for a long moment. The dust still moved slightly in the thin line of sunlight, drifting like suspended particles of time that refused to settle completely. I breathed in the familiar scent of paper and old insulation, letting the simplicity of the moment anchor me. The room remained unchanged. The case had changed. I had changed. Before leaving, I wrote a short note, just a single sentence on a blank index card, and placed it inside the front of the archive binder. Truth may rest in silence, but silence isn't the truth. It wasn't part of the official record. It wasn't meant for anyone specific. It was simply a reminder to myself, and to whoever next opened the file, that the layers of a case never belong solely to evidence. They belong to the unseen threads that hold human decisions together: fear, hesitation, instinct, regret. Threads that can be traced but not fully understood. As I turned off the light, the room dimmed into its natural half-shadow. The building seemed to exhale faintly, as if relieved the burden had been acknowledged. Walking down the hallway, the echo of each step spread outward in steady, deliberate intervals. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A custodian pushed a cart in the distance, its wheels clicking softly. Life continued, the mechanical rhythm of the world resuming as though the past had never stirred. Yet I carried something with me, an awareness sharpened by the reinvestigation. The truth wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't cinematic in the way stories often pretend. It was subtle, woven from small, precise strands that only became visible through careful attention. Truth isn't always visible on the surface. Sometimes it hides in reflections. Sometimes in silence. Sometimes in the space between what was said and what was avoided. Sometimes in a single overlooked photograph, lying dormant in an unmarked envelope. As I reached the exit and opened the door to the late afternoon light, the world felt unchanged, but I sensed the weight of clarity settling somewhere deep, quiet, steady, incomplete but honest. The case had been cold for decades. The rumors that surrounded it had grown in the absence of explanation. Now, at last, they could thin, dissipate, dissolve. Not because the truth resolved them, but because the truth replaced them, with something gentler, something real, something human. Justice, in its procedural form, had spoken, but something in me remained aware of the deeper truth, one that no report could fully capture. Even when answers emerge, some part of a story remains in shadow, shaped by the people who lived it and those who lost. And in that quiet place where certainty ends, something else lingers, an unresolved reflection, not demanding conclusion, only acknowledgement. I stepped outside, letting the door close behind me. The building stood silent. The past remained intact. And the truth, finally, had taken its place.